Do you feel safer now? Or do old wounds still echo sometimes?
You ever walk into a family holiday gathering where the air feels thicker than the gravy on the mashed potatoes, loaded with all those unspoken histories and simmering grudges that have been building for decades? Especially when the centerpiece of it all is a family business that's been the heartbeat of your small-town life since your grandfather hammered together his first workbench in a dusty Ohio shed back in the 1950s, turning it into a sprawling chain of hardware stores that supplied nails, lumber, and power tools to every contractor, farmer, and weekend warrior across the Midwest, the kind of place where folks still come in for advice on fixing a leaky faucet or building a treehouse for their kids, just like I did growing up. Learning the ropes alongside my brothers while dreaming of something bigger than inventory counts and supplier negotiations. That's exactly how it felt for me, Emily Harper, a 42-year-old divorced mom with a sharp 9-year-old daughter named Lily, waiting back in my Chicago apartment as I pulled my reliable SUV into the gravel driveway of our family home attached to the flagship Harper Hardware warehouse last Thanksgiving. The late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the stacks of plywood and paint cans visible through the chain-link fence. A sight that always stirred a mix of nostalgia and quiet resentment because for all the sweat I'd poured into keeping those ledgers balanced and those expansion plans viable over the past 20 years, I'd been cast as the background player, the dependable daughter who handled the numbers from afar rather than the face of the operation like my brothers Tom and Rick, who got the glory of ribbon cuttings and customer handshakes while I quietly wired funds from my own savings to cover their occasional oversights during market dips. Stepping through the creaky front door, I was hit with the comforting chaos of Mom's pumpkin pie baking in the oven, mingling with the faint oily scent drifting in from the warehouse where Dad probably spent the morning overseeing a last-minute shipment, and there they all were in the living room, sprawled across the mismatched furniture that's seen better days, but holds the weight of family milestones like the photo on the mantle from our high school graduations or the faded plaque from the Chamber of Commerce awarding Dad for 30 years of service to the community. Dad rose from his recliner with that familiar grunt, his broad shoulders still hinting at the strength that built this empire, but now softened by age and the stress of endless competition from those massive online retailers that promise next-day delivery, but forget the personal touch of knowing your customer's name and their latest home project, pulling me into a hug that smelled of coffee and sawdust before he stepped back to appraise me with eyes that always seemed to see the girl who married too young rather than the woman who'd bootstrapped her way through a messy divorce and into a covert world of investments that could rival any Wall Street player's portfolio. Mom bustled over from the kitchen, her apron dusted with flour, asking about Lily's latest school antics, while shooting me that knowing glance that said she worried I was working too hard in the city, far from the roots that Tom and Rick had planted deep by staying local and inserting themselves into every big decision. And as we settled around the coffee table laden with cheese platters and crackers that had been a pre-dinner ritual since I was a kid, Tom launched into his animated tale of sealing a major deal with a regional builder, inflating the profit margins to sound like he'd single-handedly rescued the quarter when in reality my behind-the-scenes tweaks to the accounting software had caught the discrepancies in their expense reports and kept us from hemorrhaging cash. A fact I let slide with a nod and a sip of wine because calling it out would only ignite the old rivalries that had simmered since we were teens fighting over who got to drive the delivery truck first. Rick joined in seamlessly, boasting about his latest lease negotiations for a new store location while scrolling through his phone, probably eyeing real estate apps in anticipation of some windfall. And I couldn't help but feel that familiar twinge of being overlooked, the way Dad's proud smiles always tilted toward them as the heir's apparent. Even though I deferred my own marketing career dreams multiple times to bail out cash flow crises they'd exacerbated with impulsive expansions, choices that now made me question in the quiet moments why I'd chosen silence over confrontation so many times before, allowing the narrative of me as the safe, unadventurous sister to take root while my brothers positioned themselves as the bold visionaries steering the ship. The conversation flowed with light laughter when Mom shared a story about Lily's video call earlier that week, describing her Daughter's enthusiastic science fair project on solar panels that had me beaming with pride. But then Dad cleared his throat in that deliberate way he does when shifting gears to business matters, setting his mug down with a thud that echoed the gravity of what was coming, mentioning offhand how the industry had evolved too fast for a family-run operation like ours to keep pace indefinitely. His words laced with a weariness that hinted at decisions already made behind closed doors, sparking that undercurrent of uncertainty I'd sensed in our recent phone check-ins where he dodged questions about quarterly reports. As we migrated toward the dining room to help set the table, the clatter of silverware against china plates underscoring the transition, Tom slapped Rick on the back with a conspiratorial whisper about their post-holiday plans. And I seized the moment for a subtle nudge, casually remarking how the real game-changer in those sales figures had been the inventory tracking system I'd advocated for against their initial resistance, the one that exposed padded reimbursements for those essential client lunches that stretched the budget thin. Watching Tom's cheeks color just enough to deliver a spark of wry satisfaction without derailing the evening entirely, a small victory in the ongoing dance of family dynamics. Yet as Dad called us back to the living room with a more serious tone, insisting the real announcement couldn't wait until after grace, the room fell into an expectant hush that left me gripping my glass a little tighter, my mind racing through possibilities from potential partnerships to outright closure, wondering if this was the threshold where my hidden maneuvers in the shadows of high finance would finally intersect with the life I'd left behind, pulling everyone toward an edge we couldn't yet see. That expectant hush Dad created by calling us back to the living room stretched out like the lengthening shadows from the setting sun filtering through the lace curtains Mom had hung back when we were kids, turning the familiar space into something charged with anticipation as we shuffled in from the dining room. The half-set table abandoned behind us with its pristine linens and the faint aroma of roasting turkey wafting from the kitchen to remind us that this was supposed to be a day of gratitude rather than the prelude to whatever seismic shift he had brewing in that weathered briefcase propped on his knee, his fingers drumming a rhythm that echoed the pulse of uncertainty I'd been carrying since spotting the first signs of financial strain in the quarterly reports he'd shared sporadically over the past year. Reports I'd scrutinized in my Chicago high-rise far from the warehouse floors where I'd once spent endless shifts as a teenager sorting bolts and dreaming of escaping to a life beyond balance sheets and bulk orders. We settled into our usual spots, Tom sprawling on the couch with that cocky lean he adopted after college when he started treating the business like his personal kingdom, Rick perching on the armrest with his phone still in hand as if ready to Google any details Dad might gloss over, and Mom hovering near the doorway with a dish towel twisted in her hands, her worry lines deepening because she knew better than anyone how this company had been Dad's obsession since marrying into the family and taking the reins from Grandpa after his passing in the 80s, transforming it from a local fixture into a regional powerhouse that employed over 200 people across Ohio and into Indiana. Folks who'd become like extended family through holiday parties and crisis support during floods or recessions. Dad began by reminiscing about the early days, his voice gravelly with the weight of memories as he described how Grandpa started with a single storefront in 1952, peddling tools to post-war builders rebuilding homes and lives in the shadow of the steel mills, a narrative that always pulled at my heartstrings because I'd inherited that same grit, the kind that drove me through night classes in accounting while raising Lily as a single mom after the divorce, quietly funneling profits from my side investments in logistics tech to patch the holes Tom and Rick poked with their aggressive expansions into untested markets like eco-friendly supplies that sounded innovative but tanked without proper vetting. As he wove the tale forward to the challenges of the digital age, where Amazon and Home Depot lured customers with algorithms and endless aisles, I nodded along but inwardly seethed at the selective history. The way he glossed over my role in negotiating those key supplier contracts during the pandemic that kept shelves stocked when competitors faltered, sacrifices like skipping vacations or dipping into my savings that my Brothers never acknowledged, instead painting themselves as the frontline heroes in boardroom battles I orchestrated from spreadsheets they'd barely glance at. The conversation meandered into lighter territory when Tom jumped in with his version of recent triumphs, exaggerating how he'd charmed a distributor into exclusive deals that supposedly doubled our lumber sales. A claim so inflated it bordered on comical given that my data dives had revealed the real bump came from seasonal demand spikes I'd forecasted months ahead, and I let a wry smile play on my lips, interjecting with a casual observation about how true innovation lay in the back end. Efficiencies rather than flashy handshakes, my words landing like a gentle prod that made Rick shift uncomfortably because he knew his own contributions often leaned on those very systems I'd implemented against their initial pushback. Mom tried to steer us toward gratitude, sharing a story from my childhood about the time Grandpa taught us all to build birdhouses during a slow summer week, a memory that bonded us, but also highlighted the diverging paths we'd taken, with Tom and Rick staying woven into the daily fabric of the stores while I'd ventured out, building a network in venture capital that now quietly outpaced the family revenue without a single boast to my name, a secrecy born from fearing their envy or Dad's disappointment in me chasing ambitions beyond the family fold. Tension simmered beneath the surface as Rick countered with complaints about regulatory hurdles slowing their growth plans, his tone laced with that familiar blame toward overly cautious elements in the operation. Code for me and my insistence on compliance checks that had saved us fines twice over, and I felt the old resentment bubble up, questioning why I'd chosen to absorb those slights silently for so long, allowing the dynamic of me as the supportive shadow to persist even as my daughter Lily thrived on the independence I'd modeled for her. Through late-night work sessions and stories of self-made success, humor crept in unexpectedly when Tom joked about using any windfall to finally upgrade to a boat for fishing trips up in the Great Lakes, envisioning lazy weekends away from the grind. And I couldn't resist quipping that he'd likely capsize it faster than he'd balanced a quarterly budget, a light-hearted jab infused with just enough truth about his past fiscal fumbles to draw a reluctant chuckle from Dad and a narrowed eye from Rick, delivering that satisfying twinge of evening the score, without escalating into outright confrontation, especially since Mom shot me a look that mixed amusement with a plea for harmony. But Dad's expression grew somber again, folding his hands as he hinted at a pivotal decision regarding the business's future, one that involved external players and changes none of us had fully anticipated. His words trailing off just as my phone vibrated discreetly in my pocket with a notification from an encrypted app tied to my investment portfolio, a subtle clue to the parallel empire I'd constructed that sent my mind racing with possibilities of intersection, forcing me to excuse myself briefly to the powder room where I glanced at the screen revealing an update on acquisition bids that mirrored the whispers I'd caught earlier. Returning to the group, the air felt heavier, charged with the unspoken conflicts of favoritism and overlooked labors, and as Dad proposed wrapping up the pre-dinner chat to focus on the meal, he added that a formal family meeting after Grace would lay everything bare, pulling us all toward the dining room with the promise of revelations that could reshape not just the business, but the fragile ties binding us together, leaving me to ponder in the clatter of chairs how much longer I could harbor my secrets before they erupted into the open. With the promise of a formal family meeting dangling like an unopened gift after the pre-dinner revelations, we finally migrated to the dining room where the long oak table, scarred from years of holiday feasts and impromptu business huddles, groaned under the weight of Mom's meticulously prepared spread, including the golden turkey she'd brined overnight, fluffy mashed potatoes whipped with real butter, green bean casserole topped with crispy onions, and that tangy cranberry sauce made from berries we'd picked at a local farm every fall since I was little, all arranged with the precision of someone who understood that food could temporarily mend the cracks in family armor even as deeper fissures threatened to widen under the pressure of Dad's impending disclosures about the fate of Harper Hardware, the business that had defined our lives from my earliest memories of toddling around the aisles clutching a toy hammer to the grueling board meetings in recent years where I'd advocated for digital upgrades that Tom and Rick dismissed as unnecessary until they saw the uptick in online orders. Grace was said in hushed tones, Dad's voice steady as he thanked the powers that be for health, home, and the enduring legacy of hard work that built this table and the stores beyond it. But my mind wandered to the irony of it all. How that same legacy now teetered on the edge of transformation because of market forces I'd been quietly countering through my covert investments in supply chain innovations that could have saved us from this crossroads if only they'd listened to my proposals. Instead of prioritizing their pet projects like flashy store remodels that drained reserves without boosting foot traffic. As plates were passed and the clink of cutlery began its rhythmic accompaniment to the meal, conversation flowed tentatively at first, with Mom steering toward neutral ground by asking about neighborhood updates and Lily's upcoming holiday play, where she'd landed the lead role as a clever inventor, a story that drew smiles and allowed me a moment to breathe amid the undercurrent of tension. Though I couldn't shake the subtle clue from my earlier phone notification about acquisition movements that hinted at paths crossing sooner than anticipated. Paths I'd forged in boardrooms far from this farmhouse where anonymity shielded me from the very family scrutiny now building with every glance Tom shot my way, as if sensing I held cards he couldn't see. Dad ate methodically, his fork carving precise portions while he built up to the main point, starting with a broad stroke about the evolving retail landscape where family-owned chains like ours faced extinction unless they adapted radically. His words laced with the resignation of a man who'd poured 60 years into something only to watch it strain under the weight of e-commerce behemoths and shifting consumer habits that favored convenience over community ties, and I nodded sympathetically, masking the frustration that boiled inside because I'd crunched the numbers showing viable pivots toward hybrid models blending physical stores with robust apps, ideas I'd emailed months ago only to receive curt acknowledgments from Rick that boiled down to them handling the big picture, while relegating me to the periphery. The siblings perked up as Dad delved deeper, Tom pausing mid-bite to lean forward with eager eyes while Rick set down his roll, and that's when the announcement landed like a thunderclap amid the holiday warmth. Dad declaring with measured finality that after careful consideration and consultations with advisors, the decision had been made to sell Harper Hardware to Summit Capital, a New York-based investment firm poised to inject $42 million into modernizing the operation, a figure that hung in the air, transforming the room from festive to fraught as he elaborated on how the proceeds would secure his and Mom's retirement while allocating substantial shares to Tom and Rick for their hands-on leadership over the years, explicitly excluding me with a paternal pat on my hand and an explanation that my city life and independent path meant I didn't require the same stake in the family anchor. Cheers erupted from my brothers almost immediately, Tom pumping his fist with a whoop that echoed off the wainscoting and Rick slapping the table in exuberant agreement. Their jubilation painting a picture of vindication for the sons who'd stayed the course while I sat there feigning a composed hurt, my smile tight as I absorbed the betrayal wrapped in tradition. The dilemma twisting in my gut whether to shatter the illusion right then by revealing my dominion over Summit or let the moment simmer toward a more calculated strike, a choice fraught with the risk of alienating Mom further or giving Lily a fractured holiday narrative she'd sense from miles away. Mom reached for my arm under the table, her squeeze conveying a mix of apology and helplessness born from years of witnessing the gender-tilted favoritism that cast daughters as supporters rather than successors. Even as I'd proven my mettle by navigating the divorce's financial wreckage into a portfolio that now eclipsed the business's valuation through savvy tech stakes, but voicing that truth felt like wielding a sledgehammer in a china shop. So I chose restraint laced with quiet rebellion, opting instead for a mini-revenge that planted seeds of unease by inquiring innocently about Summit's track record. With similar acquisitions, casually dropping a herd anecdote from industry contacts about their history of aggressive cost-cutting that led to layoffs in other family firms, watching Dad's brow furrow and Tom's enthusiasm stutter as the words took root like weeds in a well-tended garden. Humor edged in to diffuse the spike when Rick quipped about finally affording that dream garage for his classic car collection, and I countered with a wry observation that the only collection he needed to Worry about was the debt pile from those unchecked vendor perks, a light vulgar hint at the padded expenses I'd audited silently that had him flushing and Mom stifling a giggle. The satisfaction of that witty deflection warming me amid the growing conflict as it underscored their vulnerabilities without fully unleashing the storm. Yet as the meal wound down with pie slices distributed and coffee poured, the atmosphere thickened with probing questions from my siblings about my fine reaction, their smug undertones probing for cracks in my facade. And just as Dad moved to gather the contracts for review, my phone buzzed insistently in my pocket with an incoming call from an unknown number tied to Summit's inner circle, the vibration sending a jolt through me as I excused myself to the hallway, heart pounding with a realization that the threads of my hidden empire were pulling taut, on the verge of tangling with the very dinner table drama unfolding behind the closed door. Stepping into the dimly lit hallway with my phone pressed to my ear, the muffled hum of family voices from the dining room fading behind the closed door like a distant storm gathering force. I listened to the voice on the other end confirming the final signatures on the Summit Capital acquisition papers that I'd greenlit from my anonymous perch in Chicago weeks earlier. Details about integration timelines and asset valuations flowing in a clipped professional tone that contrasted sharply with the chaotic holiday backdrop where my brothers celebrated a windfall built on the very foundations I'd shored up invisibly through years of deferred dreams and strategic infusions of capital from my burgeoning tech portfolio. A parallel life of board meetings in sleek conference rooms overlooking Lake Michigan that allowed me to play the unassuming daughter without ever revealing the leverage I'd amassed to potentially steer the sale toward outcomes benefiting more than just Dad's retirement fund and my siblings' egos. The call wrapped quickly with assurances that the deal's momentum remained unchecked, leaving me staring at the faded family portrait on the wall depicting us as kids in matching overalls amid warehouse shelves stocked with gleaming tools. A snapshot of innocence before the divergences set in with Tom and Rick claiming the spotlight through Dad's favoritism while I navigated the shadows of gender expectations and marital fallout to forge my own path, and as I pocketed the device, the weight of the dilemma pressed harder, questioning whether revealing my ownership now would deliver the satisfying justice I craved or instead fracture the remnants of our bond in ways that echoed the loneliness of my divorce years. A choice laced with the uncertainty of how Mom might react to learning her practical girl had outmaneuvered the sons she'd always championed. Re-entering the dining room, the air still thick with the scent of cooling pie and spilled coffee from Rick's animated gestures during their victory laps, I slid back into my chair amid probing stares from Tom and Rick who leaned forward like detectives sensing a loose thread in my composure. Dad shuffling papers with a mix of relief and resolve as he outlined the next steps, including employee notifications and transition teams that Summit would assemble. His enthusiasm tempered by an undercurrent of nostalgia for the hands-on era when decisions happened over counter chats rather than corporate memos. And Mom cleared plates quietly, her movements deliberate as if buying time to absorb the shift from family enterprise to faceless ownership that threatened the personal connections she'd nurtured through decades of hosting staff picnics and remembering birthdays. Conversations splintered into excited speculations from my brothers, Tom envisioning seed money for a consulting firm leveraging his sales savvy, while Rick plotted real estate flips in the suburbs, their plans unfolding with the casual entitlement of those long groomed as successors, and I interjected sparingly at first, masking the internal conflict with nods that hid my calculations on how the $42 million could fund expansions I dreamed of like eco-upgrades for the stores to compete sustainably, ideas dismissed in past meetings as too visionary for our traditional model, fueling the growing resentment that had simmered since discovering through anonymous audits that they'd siphoned minor kickbacks from suppliers to pad personal accounts, betrayals I'd overlooked to preserve harmony but now regretted as self-imposed chains limiting my voice in what should have been a collective legacy. A twist unraveled further when Dad mentioned offhand the advisory role Rick had played in vetting Summit, prompting Rick to elaborate with pride on his inside track conversations that greased the deal. A revelation that confirmed my intel on his covert communications selling lowballs on our valuation to hasten the sale. his words dripping with self-importance, as if unaware I'd intercepted those exchanges through my network, and the dilemma intensified as I weighed exposing him then and there versus letting the web tighten for a more comprehensive unraveling. A restraint that even I recognized bordered on masochistic given how it prolonged the injustice of my exclusion painted as benevolence. Humor sliced through the tension when Tom joked about hosting a farewell bash at the flagship store with kegs and karaoke to mark the end of an era, and I couldn't resist a wry counter, suggesting the bash needed a budget line for auditing those farewell perks. To avoid Summit's scrutiny on loose ends, a light vulgar nod to the expense discrepancies I'd flagged silently that had him sputtering and Dad chuckling uneasily, the witty satisfaction of that mini-revenge blooming as it embarrassed him without derailing the evening entirely, especially since Mom shot me an appreciative glance amid her worry. As the group migrated to the living room for after-dinner cordials, the fire's glow casting flickering shadows that mirrored the emerging secrets, Dad pulled out a folder with preliminary terms, his voice dropping to confide in me privately about concerns over Summit's aggressive tactics gleaned from references, unaware those concerns stemmed from planted rumors I'd orchestrated to buy negotiation time. And I chose to amplify them subtly by leaking a fabricated detail about potential pension clawbacks in the fine print, watching his face drain of color as the seed of doubt took hold, a clever jab that satisfied the urge for payback by chipping at the deal's allure without my full hand showing, though it twisted the knife of ambiguity deeper since it delayed the truth that could empower him against the very entity I controlled. Tensions peaked in the hallway later when Tom cornered me alone, his breath whiskey-tinged as he pressed for my honest take on the exclusion, offering a back channel. Split from his share out of pity, his patronizing tone igniting the fire I'd banked for years, and I leaned in with a composed smile, dropping another hint by alluding to Summit's volatile leadership that might sour the payout faster than expected, leaving him pale and retreating as the conflict swelled toward confrontation. Yet as the night deepened with yawns masking the unease, my siblings regrouped in the kitchen demanding specifics on how I'd manage without a cut, their questions laced with faux concern that probed too close to my veiled prosperity. And just as I formulated a deflection, Dad's voice echoed from the study calling for one last review of the buyer's profile, the words hanging like a noose drawing tighter around the secrets poised to burst forth in the final reckoning. Dad's summons from the study pulled us all into the narrower confines of that book-lined room where shelves sagged under ledgers from decades past and framed certificates marked milestones like the expansion into our 10th store back in the 90s. A space that always felt like the nerve center of Harper Hardware's soul with its worn leather chairs and the faint musty scent of old paper mingling with the lingering holiday aromas drifting in from the kitchen, where Mom had retreated to tidy up. As if domestic tasks could buffer the emotional undercurrents now swirling toward what promised to be the capstone of his announcement, his voice carrying a note of finality as he spread the Summit Capital dossier across the desk for one last communal review. Pages detailing projected synergies and growth strategies that painted a glossy future, but glossed over the human cost in terms of the loyal staff who'd manned registers and stocked shelves through economic booms and busts, folks whose faces I could picture from annual picnics and crisis interventions during supply shortages. We crowded around, Tom and Rick flanking Dad with postures of entitled curiosity while I hung back near the door, my pulse quickening at the irony of scrutinizing a deal I'd engineered through proxies to reclaim control without the fanfare of family politics. The dilemma peaking as I debated interjecting with insider insights that could derail the momentum or holding my tongue to let the revelation unfold on my timeline, a restraint born from years of watching my contributions fade into footnotes while my brothers claimed credit for collective wins, choices that now struck me as a peculiar form of self-preservation laced with the fear of appending Lily's sense of her extended family's stability. Dad began parsing the document methodically, highlighting clauses on asset transfers and non-compete agreements that would bind the family from re-entering the hardware space for 5 years, his brow knitting as he voiced lingering qualms about the firm's opaque structure despite the impressive valuation of $42 million that secured a comfortable nest egg for him and Mom, and Rick jumped in defensively, touting his vetting process with a confidence that bordered on arrogance given the kickbacks I'd uncovered in his emails, twists that layered fresh betrayal atop the exclusion already stinging from the dinner table cheers, prompting Mom to enter quietly with a tray of after-dinner liqueurs, her eyes pleading for unity amid the growing conflict that threatened to eclipse the gratitude we'd invoked earlier. Conversation fractured into debates, Tom advocating swift closure to lock in the payout for his entrepreneurial pivots, while I subtly undermined by questioning the fine print on employee retention, dropping a veiled hint about Summit's pattern of phased buyouts that could phase out the very veterans who'd built customer loyalty through personalized service in an era when big box anonymity reigned, my words seeding doubt that made Dad pause and Rick bristle, the mini-revenge satisfying in its precision as it echoed the audits I'd conducted silently to expose their fiscal shortcuts without prior confrontation. Though the humor edged in when Tom quipped about the non-compete freeing him for bigger fish, like a food truck venture, and I retorted that the biggest fish he needed to fry was his habit of inflating projections to reel in investors, a light vulgar swipe at past deceptions that drew a tense laugh from Mom and a scowl from him, diffusing the spike just enough to keep the room from combusting before the core truth emerged. As the review dragged into the late hours with yawns masking the unease and the fire in the adjacent living room dying to embers, the dilemmas converged in a private aside Dad drew me into by the window overlooking the darkened warehouse yard, his voice low as he confessed the sale's roots in protecting the legacy from there. Mismanagement without naming names, a paternal vulnerability that humanized him after the earlier dismissals and twisted my resolve, making me wonder if unveiling my ownership would heal or hasten the fractures. Especially with Lily's upcoming visit looming as a reminder of the generational ties I couldn't sever lightly, choices that positioned me as the enigmatic guardian rather than the vengeful outsider. The group reconvened at Dad's urging for final sign-offs on intent letters, siblings pressing me anew on my post-sale plans with that mix of curiosity and condescension implying my single mom life in Chicago left me ill-equipped for windfalls, their probing igniting the final surge of resentment I'd banked since college days of unequal workloads, and as Dad named the key Summit executive helming the acquisition, my carefully chosen alias layered through shell entities, I felt the threads pull taut, the subtle clues from phone buzzes and planted rumors now culminating in the moment I'd orchestrated for maximum impact. With the room hanging on his words and cheers threatening to reignite, I stepped forward, my voice steady amid the hush as I revealed the staggering truth that I owned Summit Capital in its entirety. Having acquired the firm 2 years prior through a network of investments sparked by the divorce's ashes and fueled by the very efficiencies I'd proposed for Harper Hardware only to see rejected, turning the $42 million influx into a conduit for my vision of ethical modernization that preserved jobs and community roots while sidelining the short-sighted decisions that nearly sank us, the ownership bombshell landing like a silent explosion that drained color from faces and silenced the air. Brothers gaping in stunned betrayal and Dad's eyes widening with a mix of pride and bewilderment as realization dawned on the depth of my hidden maneuvers. The revenge crystallized in that frozen tableau, clever and witty in its reversal of fortunes where their exclusion boomeranged into my unchallenged stewardship, satisfying the long-simmered grievances without overt cruelty, yet ambiguity shrouded the aftermath as questions swirled unspoken. Had I planned the sale purely for payback against the favoritism that marginalized me as the daughter, or as a redemptive bid to salvage the business they'd jeopardized, offering perhaps a pathway back if egos allowed? And as hugs turned awkward with promises of talks in the morning, I gathered my coat amid the lingering stares, driving into the pre-dawn chill with the road ahead veiled in uncertainty, leaving the family to grapple with whether this revelation mended the legacy or scattered its pieces irreparably. A thought-provoking void where gratitude and grudge intertwined without clear resolution.